Picture this: the most powerful man in Europe, standing at the zenith of his glory, has just crushed yet another empire beneath his heel. His armies seem invincible. His empire stretches from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. Kings tremble at the mention of his name. But far to the southwest, in the sun-scorched hills of Spain and Portugal, something has gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. A wound has been opened, and it will bleed for 6 years. This is the story of Napoleon's fatal mistake, the war he could never win, the conflict that would drain his empire of men, resources, and hope. A war fought not just by armies in brilliant uniforms, but by farmers with rusty muskets, priests with daggers, and women who chose death over submission. This is the Peninsular War, and this is how it began to devour an empire. The year is 1809. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, stands astride Europe like a colossus. Just weeks ago, on the blood-soaked fields of Wagram, he delivered yet another crushing blow to the Austrian Empire. The Habsburgs, one of Europe's oldest and most powerful dynasties, have been forced to sign away their dignity along with their territories. Another humiliating peace treaty, another jewel in Napoleon's crown. From his throne in Paris, the emperor surveys an empire that seems unstoppable. But if you look closely at the map of his conquests, you'll notice something strange, something festering. In the Iberian Peninsula, that distant corner of Europe that Napoleon had invaded the previous year, the war refuses to end. It should have been simple. It should have been quick. Napoleon had toppled governments before. He'd redrawn the map of Europe 6 times. Installing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne should have been just another Tuesday for the Emperor of the French. Instead, it became his nightmare. The Spanish people had other ideas. Rather than bowing to their new king, they rose up. Every province, every city, every village became a battleground, and what Napoleon had imagined as a brief military parade had transformed into something far more sinister, a grinding, merciless war of occupation. His generals had responded with iron and fire. Spanish armies were shattered in field after field. Popular uprisings were drowned in blood. The message was clear: resistance is futile. But the Spanish didn't get the message. In February of that year, Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, finally broke the spirit of Saragossa after a siege that became legendary for its brutality. The numbers tell a horrifying story: 54,000 Spanish dead, 10,000 French. The city had fought room by room, street by street, house by house. Women fought alongside men. Children carried ammunition through streets raked by artillery fire. When the French finally entered the ruins, they found a city that had chosen martyrdom over surrender. But even the complete destruction of one of Spain's great cities, changed nothing. The Spanish remained defiant. The Portuguese stood firm. And across the Channel, the British were preparing to return. 3 months after their desperate evacuation from Corunna, a retreat that had nearly destroyed them, the British Army was back. In April 1809, a man named Wellington stepped ashore in Lisbon. History would remember him by another name, the Duke of Wellington, but that title lay in his future. For now, he was simply a general with a modest force and an immodest task: defend Portugal and strike back at the French Empire. His army was small by continental standards, just over 30,000 men, but these weren't ordinary soldiers. Redcoats drilled to perfection, capable of delivering devastating volleys of musket fire with mechanical precision, and fighting alongside them Portuguese troops who, under British training, were rapidly becoming a force that would surprise everyone, especially the French. Wellington didn't waste time. 3 weeks after landing, he moved north with deadly purpose. His target, Marshal Soult's Second Corps, which had recently occupied the city of Porto. Soult and his men had made a critical mistake. Victory had made them careless. While they should have been fortifying positions and watching the roads, they were too busy looting the region, stuffing their packs with Portuguese silver and their bellies with Portuguese wine. They never saw Wellington coming.
The attack was swift and devastating. Caught completely off guard, Soult's army broke and ran. What followed was a humiliating retreat through the mountains, the French abandoning equipment, supplies, and wounded men in their desperate flight back into Spain. Portugal was secure, for now, but Wellington wasn't satisfied with defense. He wanted to take the fight to the enemy, and that meant coordinating with Spain's Army of Extremadura, commanded by General Cuesta. On the 10th of July, the two commanders met at Casas de Miravete to hammer out a strategy. It must have been an awkward meeting. Britain and Spain had centuries of bad blood between them. The Armada, colonial rivalries, religious conflicts. The Spanish looked at the British and saw arrogant heretics with imperial ambitions. The British looked at the Spanish army and saw incompetent leadership and poorly trained troops. Neither side was entirely wrong. Wellington proposed taking command of all Allied forces. The Spanish said absolutely not. But they did agree on a joint offensive, a bold push up the Tagus Valley towards Madrid itself, supported by General Venegas advancing from the south. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious. Marshal Victor, commanding the First Corps, fell back towards the town of Talavera, but he wasn't retreating in defeat. He was concentrating his forces. King Joseph himself arrived with General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French were preparing to make a stand. But the French High Command had devised their own plan. Joseph would hold Madrid, while Soult swept down from the north with 3 full corps, the jaws of a trap designed to catch and crush the Allied armies. But Joseph grew nervous. Soult was moving too slowly. Venegas was approaching Madrid. The king made a decision. He would attack immediately. What followed was the Battle of Talavera, a savage 2-day clash that would prove something the French were desperately hoping wasn't true. The British infantry bore the brunt of the French assault. Wave after wave of French columns crashed against the British lines, and wave after wave broke upon them like surf against rocks. The British redcoats stood firm. Their discipline was inhuman. Musket volleys erupted with mechanical precision, cutting down French soldiers by the hundreds. When the French got close, British bayonets finished the work. Compared to the titanic battles being fought that same year in Austria, where armies of hundreds of thousands clashed, Talavera was a relatively small affair. But it proved something crucial. Under Wellington's command, Britain's professional army was a force that could stand toe-to-toe with Napoleon's veterans and win. In the short term, though, victory meant little. Captured dispatches revealed Soult's approach from the north. The Allied army, victorious but exposed, withdrew. Meanwhile, King Joseph wheeled south and smashed Venegas's army at the Battle of Almonacid. By autumn, the strategic situation had reset. But the Supreme Junta in Seville, the government of Free Spain, wasn't ready to give up. They raised 2 new armies and planned another attempt to liberate Madrid, converging on the capital from north and south. Wellington, now ennobled as Viscount Wellington for his victory at Talavera, wanted no part of it. The chaos of Spanish command, the lack of coordination, the broken promises of supplies that never arrived, he'd had enough. He refused to risk his precious army on another joint operation. His caution proved justified. Spanish inexperienced armies marched to disaster. At Ocana, they suffered their worst defeat of the entire war. Marshal Soult, with a smaller force, completely routed the Spanish, capturing 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannon. A week later, the army of the left was crushed at Alba de Tormes. And then Girona fell. After 7 months of epic resistance, a siege that had inspired all of Spain, the city surrendered to the French. The Supreme Junta's grand plans lay in ruins, and now southern Spain stood defenseless before the French army.
January 1810 brought catastrophe. King Joseph marched south with 60,000 men. Before his advance, Spanish resistance simply evaporated like morning mist. The Supreme Junta, blamed for the disasters, was overthrown in a coup. Córdoba fell without a fight. Seville fell without a fight. Joseph, who genuinely believed his progressive reforms could win Spanish hearts, was welcomed by many as a savior from chaos and the anarchy. It was a bitter irony. Some Spaniards now saw the French puppet king as preferable to their own failed leadership.
Only Cadiz held out. Protected by the guns of the Royal Navy, the city became the last refuge of free Spain. Victor's First Corps settled in for a siege. But Napoleon had bigger plans for the peninsula. He dispatched Marshal Massena with 65,000 reinforcements. Massena, recently ennobled as the Prince of Essling for his heroics against Austria, was considered one of Napoleon's finest commanders. His orders were simple: invade Portugal for the third time, capture Lisbon, and drive the British into the sea. First, he had to crack the border fortresses. Ciudad Rodrigo, a fortified city controlling one of the main invasion routes, came under siege. After 2 weeks of relentless bombardment, it surrendered. The road into Portugal lay open. Wellington, with only 33,000 men against Massena's 50,000, made the only sensible decision. He retreated. Massena crossed into Portugal and laid siege to Almeida, another fortress city. The garrison prepared for a long defense. They had ample ammunition, strong walls, and determined defenders. Then, after just 13 hours of bombardment, fate intervened. A French cannonball, one of thousands fired that day, struck the main powder magazine with surgical precision. 70 tons of gunpowder detonated in an explosion that could be heard from miles. The blast was so powerful that it turned the fortress into a crater. Windows shattered in villages miles away. The mushroom cloud of smoke and debris rose thousands of feet into the Portuguese sky. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to defend. The garrison surrendered. Wellington was furious. He'd been counting on Almeida to delay the French, to buy him precious time. Now Massena's army was driving deep into Portugal with frightening speed. At Busaco, Wellington found a strong defensive position and decided to make a stand. Massena attacked uphill into prepared positions. It was a bloodbath. 4,000 French casualties later, the attack had failed completely. Wellington's defensive skills had been proven once again. But the next day, French scouts found a way around the position. Wellington's retreat continued. As the French army approached Lisbon, reconnaissance patrols brought back reports that stunned Massena and his staff. Blocking the approaches to Lisbon, stretching across the entire peninsula, stood something that shouldn't exist: a vast network of fortifications, 2 complete defensive lines, the lines of Torres Vedras. For more than a year, British engineers and Portuguese laborers had been constructing this defensive masterpiece in complete secrecy. Now the lines bristled with over 100 forts, redoubts, and artillery batteries. 30,000 troops manned the defenses. 250 cannon commanded every approach. Massena rode out to inspect the lines himself. What he saw crushed his hopes of quick victory. The fortifications were far too strong to assault. Attacking them would be suicide. And there was another problem. A scorched earth strategy had stripped the surrounding countryside bare. Every farm burned, every field razed, every village emptied. There was nothing for the French to eat, nothing to forage, nothing to loot. Portuguese partisans harassed the French supply columns as they struggled through the mountain passes. Ammunition wagons were ambushed, couriers were killed, supply convoys disappeared. Massena faced an impossible situation. Too weak to attack, too proud to retreat, slowly starving in the Portuguese wilderness. So he waited, and his army slowly wasted away. But there was another group suffering even more than the French soldiers: the Portuguese civilians. When their villages and farms were burned to deny the French resources, thousands fled to Lisbon. In the overcrowded capital, disease and starvation killed them by the thousands. The innocent always pay the highest price in war. Back in France, Napoleon had other concerns. He'd divorced Empress Josephine, the love of his life, for reasons of state. Now he'd married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, sealing his alliance with his former enemies. She was pregnant with his heir. The emperor was focused on dynasty, on legacy, on the future of his empire. The war in Spain seemed distant, secondary, a problem his marshals should be able to solve. From Paris, Napoleon sent a constant stream of orders to his commanders in the peninsula. Attack here, defend there, concentrate your forces, disperse your troops. The orders arrived weeks late, hopelessly out of touch with the rapidly changing situation on the ground. Napoleon understood European warfare brilliantly, but Spain was different. The rules didn't apply, and from 1,000 miles away he couldn't grasp the reality his marshals faced daily. He now ordered Soult, based in Andalusia, to attack and draw Allied forces away from Lisbon, giving Massena a chance to take the city. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city controlling the southern invasion route into Portugal. When 12,000 men from Spain's army of Extrema mounted to relieve the siege, Soult met them in open battle and destroyed them completely. Badajoz then surrendered, yielding 8,000 prisoners and massive quantities of military stores. Another crushing defeat for Spain's military. Another city fallen, another disaster. But here's what's remarkable. Despite these catastrophic losses, despite their incompetent generals, despite defeat after defeat after defeat, Spanish soldiers kept fighting. The courage of the common soldier never wavered. They would rise again and again, no matter how many times they were knocked down. Meanwhile, at Cadiz, the besieging French forces had been weakened to support operations elsewhere. The Allied garrison saw an opportunity and attacked, landing troops along the coast to strike the French siege lines from behind. At Barossa, they were ambushed. The battle was fierce and costly. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought off the French assault. But then the British commander, Sir Graham, and the Spanish commander, General La Pena, had a massive falling out. Their inability to cooperate threw away any tactical advantage they'd gained. Soult, alarmed by these developments, marched back to Andalusia. And in front of Lisbon, Massena finally faced reality. No food, no reinforcements, no hope of taking the city. He ordered a retreat. Wellington's army pursued. As they advanced, they discovered evidence of horrific atrocities committed by the French against Portuguese villagers. Entire families massacred, villages burned with civilians locked inside. The kind of savagery that turns a war of occupation into a war of extermination. There were running battles with the French rearguard, brilliantly commanded by Marshal Ney, until Massena, stung by Ney's criticism of his leadership, fired him on the spot. Even in retreat, the French command was tearing itself apart. Wellington's forces chased the French completely out of Portugal and laid siege to Almeida. Massena, his army rested and reinforced, marched to relieve the fortress. The armies clashed again at Fuentes de Honore. 2 days of brutal fighting. Massena threw everything he had at Wellington's positions, trying to break through and save the garrison. He failed. Almeida fell the following week. Though Wellington was furious when British bungling allowed most of the French garrison to escape, the strategic situation was clear. Massena had lost. 25,000 men gone. Almeida captured, his reputation in ruins. The marshal that Napoleon had nicknamed the dear child of victory had made a string of catastrophic decisions, bringing his mistress on campaign while his men starved, ignoring the advice of experienced subordinates, losing the confidence of his officers. Napoleon recalled him to France in disgrace. Massena would never hold senior command again. Marshal Marmont arrived to replace him.
Meanwhile, Marshal Beresford, the British officer commanding Portugal's army, moved to retake Badajoz with 20,000 troops. When Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera. What happened there became one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. 6,000 casualties on each side. More than a third of the British infantry killed, wounded, or captured.
The fighting was savage beyond description. After the battle, Marshal Soult made a statement that perfectly captured what the French were learning about their British opponents. "There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I am sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine, but they did not know how to run." Soult had been checked, but he was determined to save Badajoz. Marshal Marmont marched to his aid. Their combined forces advanced again. The British were forced to abandon the siege. But when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, the French marshals didn't pursue. They'd learned a grudging respect for Wellington. They'd learned that attacking his chosen positions was a recipe for disaster. For now, the war in Spain had reached a stalemate. But while armies in bright uniforms maneuvered across Spain and Portugal, another war was being fought. Every single day. In the mountains, in the hills, in the forests, in the villages. From 1808 onward, Spanish and Portuguese civilians had been taking up arms against the invaders. Peasants, priests, former soldiers, even women and children. They fought with whatever weapons they could find: old muskets, hunting rifles, farm tools, knives, bare hands. They waged a war of ambushes and hit-and-run raids. The Spanish called it La Guerrilla, the Little War. The fighters became known as guerrilleros. The word would enter military vocabulary forever. Britain's Royal Navy supplied them with weapons, ammunition, money, and supplies, often landing these materials behind French lines in daring nighttime operations. Vast stretches of Spain's rugged countryside fell under guerrilla control. The French might hold the cities and the main roads, but the mountains belonged to the resistance. North of Madrid, a former soldier named Juan Martín Díez, known as El Empecinado, meaning the stubborn one, led a guerrilla band 6,000 strong. They controlled entire regions, collecting taxes, administering justice, running a shadow government. In Navarre, Francisco Esposimina, a former peasant, commanded a highly organized force that caused absolute havoc for the French. His men captured supply convoys and couriers on the strategic Burgos-Bayonne road. Collaborators were branded with "Viva Mina" burned into their foreheads, a mark of shame they would carry forever. In the west, Julian Sanchez Garcia, known as El Charro, led the self-styled Lancers of Casquillo. El Charro himself wore a captured French hussar's cap with its eagle symbol turned upside down, a gesture of contempt. Dozens more bands operated across Spain. Some were genuine patriots fighting for their country's freedom. Others were barely distinguishable from bandits, terrorizing civilians as often as the enemy. The guerrilla war was merciless. Atrocities became routine on both sides. The laws of civilized warfare, as such they were, did not apply. A French soldier's greatest fear was being taken alive by the guerrillas. Torture before death was common. The methods were designed to be as horrific as possible, to spread terror among the occupiers. The French retaliated with matching brutality. Suspected guerrillas were hanged or shot. Entire villages were burned. Hostages were executed. The cycle of violence spiraled endlessly downward. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down fighting this people's war. Garrison duty, patrol duty, escort duty. Men who could have been used in field armies were instead scattered across the countryside, trying to maintain control of a population that hated them. The roads became so dangerous that French messengers required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more. Even then, many didn't make it through. Their dispatches, containing valuable intelligence about French movements, plans, and dispositions, were forwarded to Wellington. The guerrillas became his eyes and ears across the peninsula. The war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers. Most died from disease, typhus, dysentery, malaria. War has always killed more men through sickness than battle. But remarkably, more French soldiers died fighting the guerrillas than in formal battles against the British and Spanish armies combined. It was the combination that made the situation impossible for the French. A professional army under Wellington that they could not defeat, and a popular insurgency they could not suppress. If the French dispersed their forces to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could attack and destroy isolated units. But if they concentrated to face Wellington in battle, the guerrillas would take over vast territories. There was no good answer, no path to victory. Napoleon himself called it his bleeding ulcer. Others have called it Napoleon's Vietnam, a war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties every single day, with no prospect of winning. And in 1812, as Napoleon assembled his massive army for the invasion of Russia, Wellington and the guerrillas would launch their own offensive, an offensive that would begin to drive the French out of Spain forever. But that is a story for another time. The Peninsular War was where Napoleon's myth of invincibility began to crack, where his marshals learned that courage and discipline could defeat superior numbers, where the people of Spain and Portugal proved that empires could be resisted. The Spanish ulcer would bleed Napoleon's empire dry, draining men and resources that would be desperately needed when the emperor faced his ultimate test in Russia. This war, this grinding, merciless people's war, was the beginning of the end. And it started because one man, standing at the height of his power, made a single catastrophic mistake. He underestimated the human spirit. He underestimated the will to resist. He underestimated Spain.